Rolling? Alright, so today we are going to talk about the Rivet Buster. We're not going to discuss everything in the video. For instance, the handle, if that gets seized up, you'll just send that back to us. We'll go through that. Each gun is different. There's we only have one or two that's this exact style, and this style for the handle. If it does get seized up, you got to have snap ring pliers to remove the valve seat and all that stuff. So that's probably something you're not going to have in the field to make your own repair for that. But the things that are most commonly going to go wrong in this are going to be up in the sleeve, involving the bit and the bushings and all that stuff, or in the valve and the piston and the movement of all that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start by just taking the collar off. In here you have the retaining spring. You'll pull that out. Pull this whole assembly out. You have your bushing and a sleeve right here that goes over the bit. The bushings tend to go bad sometimes, so if you have a job where you're doing a lot of this, you'll want your bushings and related items to be on hand. Then you have this sleeve that goes inside of there. Pretty simple setup. Just remove and replace. Then if you run into something where your hammer it just isn't working, you pull your trigger and just air shoots out, but it doesn't hammer or do anything like that, chances are it's either your piston is seized up or your valve assembly is seized up. So that's what we're going to get into now. If you have a vise or something like that, that tends to make it easier. Close up of this. You got this retaining ring. There's a locking collar right here, and you have the retaining ring that holds that on. Let me get the right tool for that. Just kind of pry it back. Pull your retaining ring on, locking collar, just slide that back. Then your handle, you just unthread that from the barrel. A lot of times these will be kind of seized up, so they can be a real bear. Yeah, something to keep in mind. Struggling here. Yeah. There's your handle. That works. We know that's good. And just so you know, this has already been cleaned up and everything, so taking this stuff apart is going to be pretty easy for us. Let me go over here and grab a little bolt real quick. So in here you have, what you're looking at is the piston. Now this piston can come out either way. It can either come out the back or out the front. So I'll push it out the back for this. Piston. Now your valve assembly, a lot of times these will get kind of locked up in there, seized up, and you won't be able to get it out. If you look around here, you'll see right there and right there have threads I think this is a 1/4 20 bolt is what they call it, but just thread that in there, and that gives you something to kind of pull on. There's your valve assembly. It's made up of 4 parts. We'll pull that apart. Also, these are difficult to get apart sometimes, usually because they're rusted up and everything else. If it's rusted up and you can't get the cap off, so you have here is like the body of the valve, the cap, and then inside is the valve itself, and then here's a little pin that kind of aligns everything. So if you can't get it apart, get the cap off, just take a razor blade and kind of tap in there with a hammer, and that'll help separate it a little bit. And then you can take a flathead screwdriver or something and carefully kind of just pry and work it out. This has already been cleaned, like I said, so it's not going to be too hard to get apart. So when you end up pulling it apart, you got to clean it to make sure that it moves freely and all that. All these surfaces here you'll want to sand down, and you'll want to use something like a real fine grit sandpaper, like 2000 grit. That's what we use. It's real fine. You could probably use a wire brush as well. You'll sand or wire brush inside your valve body really well. All these surfaces, they all touch and they all rub together, so they all got to be real clean. So then when it comes time to put it back together, stuff that in there. Then on this particular one, your valve body has a line right here, which lines up with that hole, which is where your pin goes in. Some of these valves are set up differently, so they're not all going to have that, but they may have some other kind of marking that shows where stuff goes. Then you'll want to look inside after you have it together, make sure everything's fully together, it's all aligned the way it's supposed to be. You got your pin in, then you'll be able to look inside, you see your valve. It should be able to freely move. So there's that. And then usually you should be able to shake it and hear it. If you can't move it while you're shaking it, it's probably not going to work right. So you'll want to really clean it up and get it to that point where it moves free enough that you could just shake it around and you'll hear it moving. So there's that. Your piston, a lot of times, if it's seized in there, you're going to have to bang that out with a hammer and like a dowel or of some kind. Stick it in there, tap it out with a hammer. If you're at that point and this is not moving freely, you got to hit it out. Chances are you're going to have to clean this up with your fine grit sandpaper as well, along with your barrel. Now what we use to clean the barrels out, a couple different things. If it's just got kind of like a light corrosion on it, it's not too bad. You could just use a wire or like a coned brush like this. You know, put it in, twist it around, all that stuff. Spray some detergents, oils, whatnot in there to help loosen it up. After you run through it a couple times, try to get a rag. Stuff a rag through there. Maybe take your dowel or something like that, whatever you're using. Push a rag through. Try to clean out anything that you break loose before reassembling it. You got that clean. Even this part right here, you want to get that nice and clean too, because this is where the valve sits. And it doesn't move, so if water gets in there, it just sits there and it rusts, and that's why it can be so difficult to remove it sometimes. So I got my valve all together. I'm gonna go put it back in. These, a lot of times, they have to fit in exactly one particular way. Sometimes you'll find markings on the barrel in this area somewhere, or on the outside of it somewhere. That'll just be an indicator where your pin's gonna sit. That way the valve is oriented correctly. This one doesn't have that, but you probably can't see this with the video, but inside there's one hole that just happens to be in a different place than all the rest, and it's the right size for this pin, which is right here at the bottom. So I'm going to orient my valve like that with the pin at the bottom. Then I'm going to, it's not in all the way right now, so if you see there's this big gap here, I'm just going to rotate it back, and, oh, right there. And it goes in all the way. You should be able to slide in nice and easy by hand. If you got to bang it in with a hammer or something like that, it's not right. Don't do that. So there, that's in. When it's seated all the way, if you just try to get a side view of this, just so you can see how high up it's sticking, right? It's just a very little bit, maybe an 1/8 inch, probably less. So if it's up higher than that, you want to reevaluate and make sure you have it correct. The piston, we're not going to put this in quite yet. We'll do that a different way. Put our handle back on. Let me do this. You don't want to slide this down like that, but don't want her falling out. So you get your barrel threaded onto your handle, get that nice and snug. You take your locking collar, throw it down on there, boom. Then you have this retaining ring, slide that right over top, snap it on, there it is. Then you're going to take your piston, you're going to slide it right down on the top here. Okay. So we're assuming that all this works now. It's all been cleaned up, it all works. Then you put your sleeve in, throw your bit on, then you have your bushing and your collar. Slide on like that with the metal ring facing down. Then you put your cap on. Then you slide your spring in, your retaining spring. Slap it in there. If you are using this in the water, especially, always, always, always throw tape around here because that spring will work its way out. And if you're in water where you can't see the gun itself, which is probably what you're doing, the spring will fall out and all of a sudden all your stuff will shoot it right out the end. Your piston, this whole collar, your bit, all that stuff disappears, and you don't want that. So that's it for the tutorial. Thank you.